I became light, literally. It took maybe half an hour or more. I was light, just no sense of separation, nothing. It's indivisible. The moment I came back, I realised what it was. I knew exactly what it was and what it meant and how wonderful it was. I burst into tears and raised the level of the river by about that much, I think. It suddenly made sense of everything I've been doing for 30 years in studying art, studying Chinese painting. I suddenly realised why. I may have a foothold on the door of fame simply because I'm a Guilo doing it, rather than a Chinese person doing it. And there aren't many of us. So that might give me a bit of a lift up, but that's not the point. I like being close to the ocean. I like water anyway. It was just an adventure. If you accept what I'm saying about art, then that includes everything. Everything about life. I've no idea how all that's going to change, but I think it will, inevitably, but possibly not before we blow ourselves up. We're the only creatures that have evolved consciousness to the level where we can change our environment, and the only creatures dumb enough to do so. I think it's a pressing issue. Hopefully, once people realise the ultimate role of art as self-realisation, above all the other lower level roles, and recognise how efficiently to reach towards that will change art, definitely, no question about it. And when it does, I think that will incorporate a great deal more of the Chinese tradition than of the Western tradition. And then Chinese art will seriously come into its own historically. My father was one of the leading dealers in London in the second half of the 20th century. He had a gallery in the West End called Sidney L. Moss Limited. And I was brought up surrounded by Chinese art. By the time I was 16, I probably knew more about Chinese culture than I knew about Western culture. I found what I was looking at with Chinese art was somehow far more exciting to me than what I was looking at in Western art. I loved learning, I didn't like being taught. So I left school at 14. I worked with my dad for 5 or 6 years in the late 60s, 1960s. The art market was going wild at the time. The Japanese were buying heavily in London. I saw more opportunity for expansion than my father and my much elder brother, who'd been in the business for years, did. So I decided to branch out with their blessing on my own. So I was 17 when I got the gallery. And you may fail, but at least if you set out on the journey, you've got much more chance of succeeding. Anyway, we were lucky. The market was going crazy at the time. I knew enough to buy the top stuff, and I managed to get the financing together to do so. I have a collection principle is that I buy the things I like. I'm more of a professional collector than a collecting dealer, which had plenty of space, but we were selling mostly small things. I was specialising in snuff bottles at the time, and we were selling mostly Ming and Qing porcelains, imperial porcelains and Tang horses and things like that. Things that could go in a cabinet. I think 1970 maybe. Mrs. Fong Chao Ling, had a studio in London at the time. She walked into my gallery and she introduced herself and said, "I'm a Chinese artist and I'd like you to hang my paintings on your wall." And I was intrigued. She was a terrific character, great fun. And I never really looked at Chinese paintings very seriously then. And she took me to Collett's bookshop in London, near the British Museum at the time. It's a bookshop that also sells modern Chinese paintings. I looked around, there was Fubaosha, Qibaisha, Wuchangshuo, all sorts of terrific modern paintings, none of whom were known in England. Very few were selling, and the prices were ridiculously cheap. And Mrs. Fang said, you need to get some of these, hang them in your gallery, and sell them for proper prices. So she said, well, why don't you have an exhibition of my paintings? And I was really getting into her paintings. I thought they were terrific. So I had an exhibition. We did a big opening, hung about 30 or 40 paintings on the walls. I then started getting interested in modern Chinese painting, contemporary ink painting, and found it wildly exciting. There was something about it that just knocked me out. It was so much more exciting than the Picassos and everything that was coming up on the market in London and making such enormous prices. I had exhibitions of Lo Xiaoquan, Dickons Cheung, Feng Chaoling, Chen Wenxi, and C.C. Wong. So I gradually got to know all of these contemporary expatriate Chinese artists. And it suddenly occurred to me that I should be their agent. So I contacted all of the ones I thought were great and said, can I be your agent? And not a single one of them had a global agent. So they all agreed to me being their agent. So for 25 years I was agent to some of the best Chinese artists living outside of China. It was a magical experience because it was good business, but apart from everything else, I was learning an enormous amount going around to all of these people and enjoying watching them paint. Well, I started painting. I went to C.C. Wong when I had half a dozen artists already that I was acting for. And I said, C.C., I've got all these top Chinese artists that I'm selling paintings by. I don't really understand Chinese painting. I said, can you teach me? And I said, how do I learn? And he took me into his studio, handed me a brush, put out a piece of paper and said, paint. From then on, every time I went to see an artist, I would be sitting down chatting about painting. I was just mopping up all of this information from top teachers and artists. And Lo Xiaoquan and Dickons Cheung were throwing in theory as well. Dickons Cheung does exactly the same thing with these just little adumbrated areas which come out of the big brushwork, the paper he designed so that you could tear the threads out and make patterns. It's all a very poetic exercise of seeing what happens and tickling out the magic in it. I pretty much paint every day anyway, or write. I tend to write in the mornings and paint in the afternoons and evenings. You can't be bored anymore because it's its own fun. So the moment you put out a piece of paper or start writing, it's totally entertaining. I mean, time stops. When I'm painting, I have no idea what time it is. The fundamental nature of the modern Western Revolution was a shift from product to process as the focus of aesthetics, the focus of communication through art. In the West, because of atomism and the Greek way and the Western way, everything is separate. We lost sight of the unity that we had come from. In the East, you never lost that. And that is the fundamental power of all Chinese aesthetics. And that's what Chinese painting has done. Ink and water, they were dancing partners basically. Control of the uncontrollable. It was dancing. It was dancing with the brush, dancing with the dowel. There are two aspects of Chinese painting. One is breadth and the other is depth. And the breadth is the subject matter, the surface meaning. The depth is where the meat is. That's where the meaning of art is. And the depth is how you do it. It's in the process, not the product. And the purpose of all communication, in my theory, and in the Chinese theory, is to reach the Tao, to reach that transcendent way of understanding where you unite. All Chinese aesthetics is incredibly sophisticated because for years it's been aiming directly at the Tao. And let ink be my immortality. No, I was just doing it to learn. When I literally, it was only until, it's only about 20 years ago that I began to think, oh, hang on, maybe I'm an artist. Mainly when people started taking an interest in what I was doing rather than the fact I was doing it. They were actually looking at it and saying, oh, that's nice. So then I started taking it more seriously. But up until then, I was just doing it to learn. What happened in achieving the modern revolution is we went from one ism to the next, to the next, to the next, very quickly. And each one was excitingly different. What was happening was the creativity was leading somewhere, but we forgot where it was leading. So everyone was rushing around with a compass, and then they'd forgotten where they're going, basically. What's happened is East and West have arrived at confluence now. They're both involved in the same basic idea. The West hasn't quite understood it theoretically yet, and they're still struggling with that. The East has been a bit confused by the hegemony of the West in exporting its modern revolution and saying how important it was. It wasn't. It was a local revolution. Very important in the West, totally meaningless to China. In China, all it meant was infused it with creativity again and further possibilities. It helped the emancipation. Nothing fundamentally new. I think ink art generally, and the whole tradition of Chinese painting, is still stupidly underestimated, not necessarily in terms of money, but misunderstood. And that will change probably over the next few years, the next 10, 20, 30 years. But in 100 years' time, there is no question that some of the most valuable paintings in the world, some of the most sought-after paintings in the world, will be either Chinese paintings or with that massive Chinese input. Every single artist makes a contribution. It doesn't matter how bad you are. You may be making a tiny, tiny incremental contribution, possibly only to yourself. Where I came from, how I did it, what I was influenced by, that's an art historical concern. But what I will be doing, or will have done, is absorbed much more from the Chinese aesthetic than from the Western aesthetic, and then expressed it. I'm just doing it.